In the late 1960s, a subtle but intense power struggle began in the Soviet Union. On one side was Leonid Brezhnev, the general secretary and de facto leader of the country. On the other was Alexei Kosygin, chairman of the Council of Ministers, a man who understood how the economy worked and what needed to be done to prevent the country from sliding into poverty. In public, they smiled at each other and sat at the same table. But behind the scenes, there had long been a war between them. The reason was simple. They had completely different views on the future of the Soviet Union. Kosygin saw that the economy was suffocating. Enterprises worked for the sake of figures and plans, but no one thought about real results. He understood that if the system was not changed, trouble awaited the Soviet Union. Kosygin's main idea was simple. The country should earn money, not just fulfill the plan. Before him, all Soviet enterprises worked according to the old system. It was not quality or profit that mattered, but only the figures in the reports. Factories produced tons of unnecessary products just for the sake of the plan, and goods that no one needed gathered dust in warehouses. Kosygin went against this system. He proposed allowing people to start small businesses, giving factories more autonomy and paying salaries based on performance, allowing enterprises to keep part of their profits and invest in development. This was so that factories could make a profit, as in a normal economy. If an enterprise was doing well, it should receive more. If it was doing poorly, it was not the fault of the people, but of the system itself, which needed to be changed. This was a real revolution for a socialist country. These were not just words. In 1965, the first wave of reforms began, and the initial results were stunning. Industry grew by 8%, and living standards began to rise. Even the Warsaw Pact countries, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, began to copy Kosygin's model because they saw in it a real chance to renew the socialist system. In essence, he wanted to give people more freedom so that the country could develop. These ideas were at least 20-30 years ahead of their time. And the better things went for the reformers, the stronger the resistance was from those who lived according to the old ways. Brezhnev and his entourage saw these changes as a threat. After all, if ordinary people and businesses started earning money instead of it being distributed from above, it meant that the party elite would begin to lose power. Brezhnev did not like change and did not understand economics. To be honest, he did not even try to understand it. At meetings on economic issues, Brezhnev often simply fell asleep. For him, the main thing was not the development of the country, but stability and personal authority. He did not need economic reforms. They could shake up the system and thus undermine his power. In addition, Brezhnev surrounded himself with apparatchiks, officials who lived by the principle, it is better not to change anything in order to keep your place. These were high-ranking party bosses, ministers, secretaries, the entire system that ruled the country not according to the law, but according to their own ideas. They were used to living off the old economy, where everything was distributed by phone call, by connections, and without any accountability. Kosygin's reforms threatened their comfortable life. After all, if enterprises began to work for profit rather than for paper plans, new successful people, new authorities, and new rules would emerge. This was not profitable for the party elite. Their wealth and power were based precisely on the old, inefficient system. The apparatchiks began a quiet war against Kosygin. The most despicable tactic was that they began to sabotage his reforms from within. Ministers falsified reports and concealed the real economic indicators to make it seem as if the new rules were not working. In reality, it was they themselves who were hindering change. In one story that shocked even Kosygin's closest associates, it turned out that his own decisions were being overturned by direct calls from Brezhnev's office. In other words, even when the Council of Ministers adopted something, everything was actually decided in the party offices behind Kosygin's back. He was turned into a figurehead, deprived of real power. It was during this period that the Soviet Union finally abandoned the path of reform. Theoretically, the country could have embarked on a path of economic change and growth, but the conspiracy of the apparatchiks put an end to these hopes. Time passed, and real hatred grew between the two leaders. Kosygin understood that his reforms were not needed not because they were bad, but because they interfered with the upper echelon's peaceful existence.
Brezhnev saw him as a threat and did everything he could to reduce his influence. The countries of Eastern Europe that continued with Kosygin's model achieved much greater success. In the USSR, however, the reformer was gradually squeezed out of the political scene. At a time when the apparatchiks were gradually stifling Kosygin's reforms, a new phase was beginning in the country, an oil-driven economic boom. The Soviet Union suddenly found itself in a winning position. World oil prices rose sharply, and billions of dollars poured into the country. This money could have been an opportunity for reform, and the economy could have begun to recover. But instead, another, no less brutal war began, the struggle for petrodollars. It was Alexei Kosygin who was the first to understand that oil could become the basis of the USSR's economic stability. Before that, the Soviet Union hardly sold any oil abroad. Exports were symbolic and of no serious significance. It was Kosygin who insisted on the construction of new pipelines, the development of fields in Siberia, and the expansion of trade with the West. In essence, he saved the country's economy at a time when the plant system was beginning to fall apart. But along with oil, new problems came to the country. These billions of dollars quickly became the main subject of struggle within the Soviet elite. Brezhnev and his entourage saw petrodollars not as a way to develop the economy, but as a chance to strengthen their power. Instead of investing money in industry, technology, agriculture, or continuing Kosygin's reforms, oil revenues began to be spent on maintaining an illusion of prosperity. These were subsidies to unprofitable enterprises, subsidies for cheap food and goods, the construction of pompous buildings, and military power. In 1973, when oil prices skyrocketed, the USSR began to earn billions of dollars annually. But this money did not go where it should have. It was not used to modernize the country, but to hide problems and delay the inevitable crisis. The Soviet economy became like a house of cards, beautiful on the outside, but fragile on the inside. At this time, Kosygin's influence continued to decline. No one was interested in his ideas anymore. Petrodollars became the new power. The party leadership had every opportunity not to change the system, just to pour money into it. By the early 1980s, the USSR's economy was completely addicted to oil.
When oil prices fell, the collapse began, for which the country was unprepared. Kosygin, who originally created this oil cushion, found himself thrown overboard. He was not even invited to important economic meetings, and later he was practically erased from public life. When the struggle between Brezhnev and Kosygin entered an open phase, it went beyond backroom games. A deliberate and harsh humiliation of Kosygin began right before the eyes of the entire political elite. It was no longer just a battle of ideas, it was personal revenge. Kosygin remained chairman of the Council of Ministers, meaning he was officially the second most powerful person in the country. But his power was being taken away from him step by step. The worst thing was that this was not happening behind the scenes, but openly, in full view of everyone. He was deliberately portrayed as weak, useless, and even ridiculous. Brezhnev did everything he could to ensure that Kosygin was no longer taken seriously. It began with him simply being banned from appearing on television. Even when important economic events took place, not a single statement came from Kosygin. He was as if erased from the public sphere. People began to forget who was really in charge of the country's economy. In the eyes of the citizens, Brezhnev was the only one in charge. Kosygin became increasingly withdrawn. Even those who had previously supported him began to turn away. In the Soviet Union, it was always dangerous to associate with someone who had fallen out of favor, especially if it became publicly obvious. Brezhnev and his team did it methodically. No loud scandals, no direct accusations. Day after day, Kosygin was stripped of his powers, his platform, his airtime, and his respect. It was psychological punishment, slow and humiliating. Documents preserved in the archives show that many of his proposals were simply thrown into the trash without discussion. He remained in office, as it were, but he had no real power. Outwardly, it seemed that Kosygin had managed to stay afloat for a long time. He still held a high position, appeared at official events, and had his photos printed in newspapers. But behind this facade lay a real personal tragedy. The man who had tried to save the economy and change the country found himself alone against the entire system. Kosygin saw clearly that the country was going downhill.
The economy was suffocating, factories were operating according to old patterns, and no one wanted real change. But he did not give up until the end. Even when he was stripped of his public role and power, he continued to fight. He wrote notes, reports, and proposals, all in vain. All his papers were thrown in the trash, and he became increasingly isolated. Such persecution could not pass without a trace. Against the backdrop of constant pressure and humiliation, Kosygin suffered 2 heart attacks. It was not only a physical blow, it was moral destruction. He felt that he had lost. He was deprived not only of power, but also of the meaning of life. The reforms to which he had devoted himself were trampled underfoot. Thus, anyone could see that the struggle for truth and change could cost not only one's career, but also one's health, personal life, and relationships with loved ones. When Kosygin finally lost his influence and health, the moment arrived that was referred to in Soviet politics as a soft coup. This is when a person is not removed by force or arrested, but simply forced to leave, so that everything looks voluntary and without fuss. Kosygin held on for a long time. Despite heart attacks and public humiliation, he continued to perform his duties. But by the end of 1979, it became clear that he had been completely written off. The authorities no longer needed his experience or his advice. They simply made it clear to him that he was in the way and forced him to write a letter of resignation. He was not even given the opportunity to discuss it or speak publicly. Everything had been decided in advance. Formally, the reason given was health reasons. But everyone understood that this was the end of his political career. He was removed without open conflict, but in the most humiliating way possible, as if he were a broken part that had been discarded. After his departure, the second stage of Kosygin's destruction began, no longer as a politician, but as a person. His name began to be erased from newspapers, textbooks, and official speeches. People simply stopped talking about him. This was typical practice for the Soviet system. If a person got in the way, they not only removed him, but also tried to pretend that he had never existed. Kosygin died 2 months after his resignation, in December 1980. His funeral was extremely modest. None of the country's top leaders even gave a farewell speech. Some of Kosygin's ideas, which were rejected in the USSR, were implemented in China a few years later. There, enterprises were allowed to make a profit, and people were given the opportunity to earn money and engage in small business. The result was stunning. China began to grow and became one of the world's leading economies. In other words, what Kosygin called unacceptable for socialism led to an economic miracle in another socialist state. In the USSR, however, everything went the opposite way. When oil prices fell in the early 1980s, the country's economy began to collapse. There was not enough money to buy food, for production, or for social services. There were shortages of goods, queues, and a lack of basic necessities. And most importantly, no one knew what to do about it. There were no longer any people around who could offer a solution, like Kosygin. And these are not just words.
Even today, many historians and economists recognize that if the country's leadership had supported Kosygin in the 1960s and 1970s, the Soviet Union might well not have collapsed. His reforms could have been the turning point that saved the country from collapse.